From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the McLaughlin Group. I'm Tom Rogan. This week's guests are Eleanor Clift, Clarence Page, Pat Buchanan, and our special guest this week is Kelsey Bolar. We're going to be discussing the latest on the campaign trail, trials and tribulations at the United Nations, the situation in Louisville, Kentucky, and more. But we'll get to our first issue, which is issue 1, replacing RBG.
So I'll tell you what Justice O'Connor once said to me. She said, suppose we had come of age at a time when women lawyers were welcome at the bar. You know what? Today we would be retired partners from some large law firm. But because that route was not open to us, we had to find another way, and we both end up on the United States Supreme Court.
After 27 years' service as a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away last Friday at the age of 87. Her death, due to complications from pancreatic cancer, has sparked nationwide mourning. An icon of the liberal wing of the nation's highest court, Bader Ginsburg was known for her incisive opinions, particularly on cases involving women's rights. She was also known for her witty humor. But this is an election year. In turn, and to Democratic Party fury, President Trump says that he will announce his nominee to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
I'm going to make it, I believe, at 5 o'clock on Saturday. I'll be having a conference.
Pat, your thoughts on President Trump's decision very rapidly to move towards replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Doing exactly the right thing, Tom. We are seeing the culmination of a 50-year struggle ever since Abe Fortas was denied the Chief Justiceship that he had been nominated to by LBJ. Conservatives have fought this battle for years and decades. Now they are on the cusp of victory when an 87-year-old liberal icon is about to be replaced by a woman 40 years younger, a judge who was a great star of the conservative movement, the judicial movement. And as you pointed out, the Democrats are enraged, angry, in panic. They're talking about, stacking the Supreme Court, packing the Senate if they can, getting rid of the Electoral College, every threat they can make against Republicans. But this is on track, I think, to change alter the Supreme Court for the next 20 years. Historic.
Eleanor, your thoughts?
Well, Mitch McConnell changed the rules in 2016, actually wrote a new rule in 2016 to deny Barack Obama a choice of his person on the Supreme Court, Merrick Garner. And McConnell basically didn't follow his own rule that said you didn't nominate a new justice in the last year of a presidency. He held the vacancy open for 14 months after in 2016. Now they're trying to rush through as a justice to fill this seat 40 odd days before the election. So, politics has an odd way of not always unfolding the way you think it ought to. And I think the Republicans here, it's like the dog that caught the car. Now they're about to cement a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. And they're doing it with a raw exercise of power. They're not even pretending it's anything other than that. And you've got a president who is talking about seating his justice on the Supreme Court to get a majority ruling to throw out the ballots of the upcoming election.
Kelsey, one of the things we see here is obviously the great partisan divide about the appointment. But is there a risk that, one of the last remaining institutions that Chief Justice Roberts has been very keen to uphold, the idea of the court as the last resort of the non-partisan, is in danger here because of the really obvious political component in which this push to renominate or to nominate someone to replace Bader Ginsburg is taking place?
Well, Tom, I think we're unfortunately long past that question. The Supreme Court has been politicized for some time now. But I think, recently in just the last term, we saw some of these constitutionalist, so-called conservative judges actually side with the liberal justices. And that goes to show if you are a constitutionalist, conservatives might appreciate that, but that doesn't always mean you're going to rule conservatively. And I think that is important to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, I do want to pay my respects to the late Justice Ginsburg. I, as a conservative, certainly politically didn't often align myself with her, but she did shatter a lot of glass ceilings that I, as a young female, can appreciate. We all should. She's done a lot for women in their opportunities and also for the disability community. So we all should applaud her and mourn her passing. I do want to point out, with all due respect, Eleanor, I noticed you said that Mitch McConnell is basically not following his own rule. And, that's true. He's basically not following it, but there is an important distinction. What happened when Barack Obama appointed justice, Republicans had control of the Senate, and then you had a Democrat president. In this case, Republicans control the Senate, and we have a Republican president. We have a constitutional duty to nominate and fill this seat, and so the president is moving forward. Elections do have consequences.
Clarence, your thoughts?
Well, it's not a law that he broke. It's not even a formal rule. It's a norm. And we've seen a lot of norms broken here in recent years. In the past, there was a sense that in the interest of having a nonpartisan court, one did not blatantly play hardball politics. That's just what's happening here. Chief Justice Roberts, to his credit, has been one who has tried to shed that image from the court that you've got a Republican justice and a Democratic justice. The result was something like what you saw when he saved Obamacare. With a decision to just outrage conservatives, even though Roberts is a smart enough man to have a very well-reasoned opinion there. But now you've got an additional conservative vote on the court, and we'll see how that plays out. But the court is unfortunately political and unfortunately ideological. But in the past, we've had some surprises, like Chief Justice Warren, who was about the most progressive and activist Chief Justice that we've had in a couple of generations. And at the same time, he was one of the most conservative governors out in California. So we'll see what happens, to use one of President Trump's favorite phrases.
Pat, round robin here, but Pat, how much do you think, let's say President Trump gets his nominee through, do you seriously expect that issues like abortion, Roe v. Wade, gay marriage are going to be relitigated? That, I mean, my impression with Roberts is that stuff is kind of gone for conservatives in the way that perhaps some social conservatives think it still might be an opportunity. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're correct when it comes to gay marriage. No one's going to say it is no longer a constitutional right or right protected by the Supreme Court. When Roe v. Wade, there's a possibility it could be overturned down the road. But what would happen? I think California, New York, Illinois, they would return to their state laws, which are extremely liberal already. Might affect some southern states. But let me mention, Clarence says, talks about political hardball. Some of us went through the Bork hearing and saw what was done to Robert Bork, brilliant jurist, what was done to Clarence Thomas, dragged as he was through that scandalous material, what was done to Brett Kavanaugh. It is the liberal Democrats who have borked these judges, beginning with Clarence Hainsworth, when I was in Richard Nixon's White House. They've done that for years. Now we're on the cusp of victory. And I say, I know the liberals are unhappy, but let them howl.
All right, Eleanor.
I say let the conservatives howl. When we're living in a country where Roe v. Wade and the right to reproductive health care is assumed by generations of women, watch what happens when those rulings come down. And this is about a lot more than abortion. The court is going to hear a case on the Obamacare, on the Affordable Care Act, a week after the election. you want these justices, they're all basically on record in earlier cases, these conservatives, that they want to overturn Obamacare. It's been Trump's greatest wish. Take away insurance from 21 million people in the middle of a pandemic. That's what this is about. And all the other issues, climate change out there. You will have four justices on the court that have been appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote, out of step with the country, and that has consequences. And if the Democrats are going to try to slow this down as long as they can, and any normal judicial appointment takes 60 or 70 days. So they legitimately, you go through the hearing, you go through the vote, you go through the debate. It could the vote may not take place until after the election, a lame duck Congress. And if Biden wins the presidency, the Democrats take the Senate, you will have a discredited, defeated president naming a Supreme Court appointee for decades into the future. How is that going to play with the American people?
Okay, quickly, Kelsey.
Well, this is the problem with the left. They look to the Supreme Court to further their legislative priorities, their legislative agenda, when really, if there are certain policies they want to cement before the American public, they need to go through Congress. They need to convince Americans on both sides of the aisle to support the policies. Of course, Obamacare lawsuits have been working their way through the courts for some time now, but this is why we have seen such outrage when it comes to President Trump nominating someone right now, and that is because Democrats have turned to the court to enact their legislative agenda.
Clarence, you get the concluding word.
Republicans have done the very same thing, and there are a lot of measures. It took Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act, but it took the court to have a Brown versus Board. There are certain decisions where the court has to move, be what it's supposed to be, the highest court in the land, and not be so democratic in terms of answering to either the political majority or political minorities here and there. You're absolutely right, though. Roe versus Wade, from a legal scholar's point of view, was hardly it was a flawed decision in its reasoning. But it was a wanted decision, and polls still show overwhelmingly that the pro-choice position wins. And now it's the time to see how outraged the left is, how outraged people are who do want to have choice. And that's where you're going to see more political activism.
All right, we will move on. But on that Brown v. School Board, that great case, no separate but equal in terms of segregation. But at least on the panel, we can be separate but equal in voice. Wonderful. Anyway, I have trust in John Roberts to get it right. We shall move on to issue 2, undiplomatic.
We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China.
Some approach. We should see each other as members of the same big family, pursue win-win cooperation, and rise above ideological disputes and not fall into the trap of clash of civilizations.
Remotely addressing the 75th UN General Assembly this week, President Trump and Chairman Xi Jinping of China traded both overt and veiled barbs. Relations between the two powers have soured in recent months over a range of issues, including the coronavirus pandemic, the situation in Hong Kong, China's trade practices, and Beijing's attempt to seize the near entirety of the South China Sea. Reflecting these disagreements, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a broader warning to the world.
But at the same time, we must do everything to avoid a new Cold War. We are moving in a very dangerous direction. Our world cannot afford a future where the two largest economies split the globe in a great fracture, each with its own trade and financial rules and internet and artificial intelligence capacities.
Eleanor, your thoughts on what we saw at the UN this week and the Secretary General's warning there?
Competition with China is the great challenge of this century. It's the great challenge economically, diplomatically, and maybe even militarily. But right now, this is all about the president trying to blame China for the coronavirus. It started there. They didn't do enough to contain it. That's all true. This is blame shifting. The president basically is trying to control the intelligence that comes out to the American people from his own intelligence community that is trying to escalate concerns about China interfering in the election while setting aside any interference from Russia, when it's basically Russia who is in here elevating as much conflict as they can find in the country, and there's plenty of it, most of it generated by the president, and amplifying that on his behalf. So, China, it's a big challenge, but frankly, this week, with everything else that's going on, not my top two.
Okay, Pat.
I take it a little more seriously than that, to be honest. I think what's happening is the Trump administration, and I don't know that Trump is all in on that because he believes in trade and tariffs, et cetera, but is decoupling from China. And we're getting tougher and tougher with China in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of what we say about what's going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, in terms of Hong Kong. And I think Xi Jinping, quite frankly, has said, enough is enough. We showed you folks that you don't fool around in Hong Kong, so we've cracked down and denied them rights they previously had. There are now the confliction between American and naval ships and planes, China's and ours, in the South China Sea. And China is now, the big casino for them is Taiwan. And they have moved pretty close to almost to preemptive attacks, or at least simulated preemptive attacks. I don't believe we want a war with China, and I don't believe we can be certain they're going to back away.
Clarence.
Well, this was a very interesting pair of speeches to watch. They were, of course, pre-recorded because of the coronavirus. But here we had President Trump as belligerent as ever about the China virus, quote unquote, and what China's doing to us, and how he's pushing back and fighting back to protecting American interests. It was this typical America First rally speech in many ways. Meanwhile, President Xi is the one talking about the global village, and let's move toward a more internationalist future. What I was seeing here was, rhetorically at least, China trying to move in to fill the gap of global influence that the United States has had for a long time. And now under President Trump, we're kind of turning our back on that, with the exception of whatever trade deal we can get that will benefit us. So I think this is something that I don't like to see China expanding its influence and under its ulterior motives, like Pat was saying. And this is not healthy for the United States. But in that sense, this was a week at the UN worth looking at.
Okay, Kelsey.
Well, I hope the one thing we can all agree on this panel is that none of us trust China. Between the human rights violations and the aggression they've displayed during the Trump administration, it's clear they are not our allies, and we need a president who is going to put America first, who is going to call out China on its human rights violations, and is going to speak the truth about where this pandemic started. That is certainly the biggest issue, not just in this country, but in the world. And President Trump at the UN had an opportunity to call out the Chinese Communist Party on the world stage. And I absolutely support him in doing that. And I think he was right to make that a theme. I do fear we are headed towards a Cold War with China, but backing down and being soft is not the answer to standing up to China's aggression.
We'll move on. My thoughts, Xi Jinping is a pathological liar when it comes to his desire to supposedly displace the American order. Let's see if that carbon neutral really happens.
Yeah, we have a pathological liar too.
Ours one, at least if we have one, he doesn't keep millions of people in concentration camps. Anyway, we will move on to our third issue, which is issue 3, Louisville.
In the matter of Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Brett Hankison, the Jefferson County Grand Jury charges as follows. Count 1, wanton endangerment in the first degree.
A Kentucky grand jury on Wednesday announced the indictment of Officer Brett Hankison in the shooting of Breonna Taylor. Officer Hankison is the only one of 3 officers involved in the shooting to be indicted. Ms. Taylor, an emergency room technician, was killed in March after a botched police raid. Fearing a home invasion, Ms. Taylor's boyfriend opened fire on police, leading them to return fire and kill Ms. Taylor. Protests and rioting followed the announcement.
You know, Clarence, there's obviously, understandably, a lot of emotion surrounding this. And I suppose this charge sheet suggests that Police officers have a right to defend themselves, even in uncertain situations. But where, as in this case, they enter a residence where there may be civilians, you can't simply open fire. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
One of the big problems that a number of protesters pointed out was there was no video of this particular raid. So people did not get as excited about it to the same degree as they did over George Floyd, Laquan McDonald in Chicago, and on and on. Fewer than a third of police officers accused of this kind of violation of civil rights are found guilty. It's hard to convict a police officer. We saw that in there in New York, the victim who said, "I can't breathe" before he died.
Eric Garner.
Eric Garner, thank you. That's the kind of case that it seemed pretty obvious to us watching on video that there was police malpractice here, but the jury didn't go for it. That tends to be what happens, and the result is hundreds of millions of dollars in costs, legal costs, in civil suits paid by Chicago, New York, LA, on and on around the country. But the police officers who committed the episode are still on duty.
But of course, Pat, we saw those two police officers shot. There is a lot of, where do you see the situation as we play into the election?
Let's take the case of Officer Mattingly. They had a no-knock warrant. They announced they were police. They broke into the door, and the guy who was in there with Breonna, he fires a shot. They didn't intend to kill her. They didn't intend to shoot her. So I don't think you can charge them. How does this play? I disagree with Clarence to this extent. The two police officers were shot in Louisville last night, obviously deliberately. And if these riots come out again and the cops are being shot, the more that becomes an issue, the more Black Lives Matter, which is associated with these demonstrations, many of which have gone violent, the more they do that, the less esteem they have in the public eye, and the greater the shift toward Trump. And I believe what shows that is that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden both came out immediately to denounce what happened to those cops and say we're praying for their health.
Eleanor.
Of course he denounced the violence. Why, that's not a surprise.
Good for him.
That's not, don't be so snarky and say good for him. Nobody wants the violence. The only person who's encouraging violence is the president. And there were armed vigilantes who were on the street in Louisville the other night. Look, you just had a $12 million wrongful death settlement in Louisville for Breonna Taylor's family. And then you have one officer charged with reckless endangerment shooting because he shot into the neighboring apartment. And then you have the two officers that fired 6 shots that killed Breonna Taylor in her bed, cleared. And the boyfriend said he felt it was a home invasion. They did not identify themselves. They were in plain clothes. He fires 1 shot. What about all that stand your ground? My home, your home is your castle. All that stuff that we hear from Republicans all the time. It doesn't apply to Black people. He can't defend himself.
Kelsey, on Eleanor's point there is a sort of narrative that seeps into conservative thought sometimes that perhaps some stand your grounds are more worthy than others. How do you respond to what Eleanor just suggested there?
She made some very good points that we all have to remember. The police reportedly did knock. There was at least one witness who heard the knocks and the police announced themselves. But Breonna's boyfriend, who was inside, says he did not hear the police announce themselves. And you can imagine if you were him, somebody entering your apartment or your house at midnight when you are half asleep, even if they did announce themselves, that can be very difficult to hear. And you can imagine legal gun owners would want to protect themselves and those inside their homes. So I do not blame him for that. And that is part of the reason why this is so tragic. And to that point, considering the police officer was actually shot at first, we cannot ask police officers not to return fire after they are shot at. And so that is why there was no indictment directly related to Breonna Taylor. But could something have been done to prevent this tragedy from happening? I think so.
And of course, people would say, the police would say, we need the no-knock sometimes because people will destroy evidence and will be ambushed. But as we see in this case, bad intelligence and perhaps excessive force has resulted in the death of a talented young woman. Anyway, I'm sure we'll come back
As
to
I
this broader
understand,
issue.
this was not executed as a no-knock warrant, by the way, although it's been widely reported. They didn't actually execute it as a no-knock. I just want to throw that out there.
Okay, thanks, Clarence. We will move on to predictions. Pat.
I think the House is going to come out with a bill to deal with the COVID-19 crisis and send it over to the Senate. And I think there's a possibility we'll get something before November 3rd.
Eleanor.
The hearings to grill the new Supreme Court nominee are supposed to take place in early October, right around the time of the vice presidential debate. Either way, there will be a lot of pressure on Kamala Harris to take her seat on the Judiciary Committee and grill the prospective nominee. This plays to her strength, and it's high political drama. Two women, since we do know the new nominee will be a woman.
Okay, Kelsey.
Well, I'm not sure we're going to see an end to these riots and violence, no matter who wins the election in November. When this Breonna Taylor case opened the door for meaningful police reform, we're still seeing riots continue. And so I fear that this is going to become our new normal.
Okay, Clarence.
Well, so President Trump and a number of other conservatives, including my dear friend Pat, have been talking a lot about how Joe Biden can barely stand up, let alone debate. Watch that narrative shift 180 degrees so we get closer to the debate, and you're going to hear Joe Biden is the most brilliant debater we've had since Webster, at least.
Okay, I predict on that note, whoever wins the debate next week, Chris Wallace will get rave reviews, the moderator, as he did in the 2016 election. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.